There's a particular sound a woman makes when she thinks no one can hear her crying in a car at 11 at night, and once you've heard it through a thin cottage wall, you never forget it. I stood on my own porch that night with a mug going cold in my hand, telling myself it wasn't my business, and knowing already that it was about to become exactly that. My name is Caleb Whitfield. I'm 32, and I run what's left of my grandfather's dairy farm just outside Millbrook Falls, Vermont. Left is the honest word for it. 20 years ago, there were 40 head of cattle on this land and 3 hired hands who ate breakfast at my mother's table. Now there are 6 cows, a hay barn with a roof I patch every October, and me. My father passed when I was 24. My mother followed him 4 years later, quieter, like she'd simply run out of reasons to stay once he was gone. I kept the farm because selling it felt like agreeing that none of it had mattered, and I wasn't ready to agree to that. I'm not a romantic about it. Most days it's just work, feeding, mending fence, hauling milk cans down to the co-op before sunrise, falling asleep some nights still wearing my boots. The quiet used to bother me. Somewhere along the way I stopped noticing it, which I understand now wasn't healing. It was just distance. There's a small guest cottage on the property, down past the second barn, that my grandmother used to rent out to summer people, back when Millbrook Falls still had summer people worth speaking of. I'd let it sit empty for years, patched the roof once, told myself I'd get around to fixing the rest. Then, 8 months ago, a woman named Rosalind answered the flyer I'd finally worked up the nerve to post at the general store. $200 a month, utilities included, because I didn't have the heart to ask more from a place with a bathroom door that didn't quite latch. Rosalind was 29, quick and careful in the way people get when life has taught them not to trust a soft landing. She worked the early shift at the diner on Route 9, 3 afternoons a week at the assisted living home 2 towns over doing hair and nails for the residents, and most nights she drove 40 minutes to clean offices in Rutland after everything else closed. I knew her schedule better than I knew my own, because I was usually up before dawn milking when her headlights swung out of the driveway, and I was usually still awake mending something in the barn when they swung back in past midnight. She'd wave through the windshield. I'd lift a hand back. That was the whole of it for a long time. 2 people orbiting the same 6 acres, careful not to get too close to each other's gravity. I didn't know why she needed 3 jobs to make rent on a $200 cottage until the night I heard her crying in that car. I'd gone out to check on a fence post that had been leaning since the last storm. More excuse than errand, if I'm honest, because I'd seen her headlights come in 20 minutes earlier and never heard her car door close. She was still sitting behind the wheel in the dark, both hands on top of it, forehead resting against her knuckles, shoulders moving in that silent, exhausted way that isn't dramatic at all, just a body finally admitting it can't hold everything up a second longer. I stood at the fence line longer than I should have, not wanting to intrude, not able to make myself walk away either. Eventually she lifted her head, wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand like she was angry at it for betraying her, and caught sight of me standing there in the dark, holding a coil of wire I didn't need. She didn't pretend. That was the thing about Rosalind I'd come to respect even in our distance. She never bothered pretending once she'd been caught. "Fence again?" she asked, voice rough. "Fence again," I said. Then, because the lie felt worse than the truth, I added, "Heard your engine and figured I'd check you were all right." She almost smiled. Word travels fast for a man who lives half a mile from his nearest neighbor. Nights are quiet out here. Carrie's. She was quiet a moment, looking at the dark shape of the cottage like it owed her an explanation. "I'm 300 short this month," she said finally, plain as weather. "I know rent's due Friday. I've got most of it. I just don't have all of it, and I've been sitting in this car trying to figure out which bill doesn't get paid instead." I didn't say anything right away, because the honest first thing that came to mind was that a woman working 3 jobs to make $200 a month rent wasn't a math problem. She was carrying something she hadn't told me about, and it wasn't my place to ask. So instead I said the only thing that felt true. "Friday's fine. Whenever you've got it's fine." "I don't want charity, Caleb, it's not charity. It's a landlord telling a tenant the due date's flexible. Landlords do that." "Not the ones I've had," she said, And there was something under those 5 words heavy enough that I felt it land in my own chest before I understood why. She got out of the car then, and in the porch light spilling faint from the cottage window I saw for the first time how tired she actually was. Not the ordinary tired of a long shift, but the kind that sits behind the eyes and doesn't leave even after sleep. She thanked me again, said goodnight, and disappeared inside. I stood at that leaning fence post a long while after her light went out, holding wire I still didn't need, understanding that I'd just been handed the edge of something I couldn't unsee. For the next 2 weeks I found myself paying attention in ways I hadn't let myself before. The dent in her car door she never got fixed. The way she carried her cleaning shoes in a grocery bag so the diner grease wouldn't ruin them for the nursing home shift. The single grocery bag she brought in most weeks, never two. I started leaving things at her door that could pass as neighborly instead of charitable. A dozen eggs from my own hens. A jar of my mother's old strawberry preserves from the cellar shelf. A bag of firewood split smaller than I needed to split it. Because the nights had turned cold, and her wood stove was older than mine. She never said much about it directly, but she started leaving things back. A plate of biscuits on my porch rail some mornings. Once, a note that just said thank you for the eggs. The hens have better taste than I expected, which made me laugh out loud in an empty kitchen for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. It was Rosalind who told me, eventually, without my asking why 3 jobs still weren't enough. We were sitting on the cottage steps one evening in October, her shift done early for once. Both of us watching the last cows amble toward the barn on their own schedule the way cows do. My mother's house is 2 towns over, she said, out of nowhere, like she'd been building up to it for weeks and just decided the wall had come down enough. Small place on Miller Street. She raised me in it. When she died, there wasn't enough left to cover what she owed the bank, so it went up for sale. A man named Grady Poole bought it at auction. He buys up half the estate sales in the county, fixes nothing, rents them out at triple what they're worth to people who don't have another choice. He's renting my mother's house right now to strangers for $1,100 a month, and every month I don't have enough saved to make him an offer. Somebody else is living in the kitchen where she taught me to bake bread. You're trying to buy it back, I said, understanding the 3 jobs all at once. The grocery bag that was never 2, the coat she wore 3 winters running. I'm trying, she said. I'm about $4,000 from being able to make him a real offer instead of an insulting one. At the rate I'm saving, that's another year, maybe more, and Grady doesn't wait around out of sentiment for anybody. She looked over at me, half apologetic, like she'd said too much. So that's why rent's tight some months. I'm not careless with money. I'm just spread thinner than a person can really stretch. I didn't offer to fix it for her that night. I understood, even then, that offering money would have insulted the very thing she was fighting to hold on to. The idea that this was hers to do. Hers to earn back. On her own terms. What I did instead was quieter. I started asking her opinion on things around the farm that didn't strictly need her opinion, which fence line to move, whether the old orchard was worth saving, whether she thought the hens needed a bigger coop before winter. She always answered like she'd been asked something that mattered, and slowly, without either of us naming it, the 6 acres between our 2 front doors got smaller. By the middle of November, the porch had become a habit. Most evenings when both our schedules allowed it, we sat out there past dark, her wrapped in a blanket she kept on the rail for exactly that purpose, me usually still smelling of hay and diesel. Both of us talking about nothing that mattered, until eventually we were talking about everything that did. She told me about her mother's laugh, how it used to fill up the whole kitchen on Miller Street. I told her about my father teaching me to read a storm coming off the ridge by the way the cows bunched together in the low pasture. She asked once, careful, why a man my age was running a dying farm alone instead of selling it and starting somewhere easier. I told her the truth, that some things you keep not because they're easy, but because letting them go would mean admitting the people who built them didn't matter. And I wasn't ready to admit that. She was quiet a long time after that, then reached over and squeezed my hand once, just once, and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. One Saturday in late October, her car wouldn't turn over at all. Dead battery she'd been ignoring for a week, because a new one meant a bill she didn't have room for, and she stood at the end of the driveway in her diner uniform, with her hands on her hips, staring at the hood like she could will it into cooperation. I came down from the hay barn, jumper cables already in hand before she'd finished explaining, because I'd clocked the sound of a starter dying 3 mornings running and simply hadn't said anything, waiting to see if she'd ask before I offered. She didn't ask. She never asked for anything she thought she could still white-knuckle her way through alone. I hooked the cables anyway, got her running, and when she tried to press 2 crumpled 20s into my hand for the trouble, I closed her fingers back around them the way I'd later closed them around a different set of keys entirely. Buy the battery when you can, I told her. Cables are free. Neighbors are free. You keep saying that word, neighbors. It's the only word I've got that doesn't scare you off the porch. She laughed at that. A real laugh. The kind that came up out of her before she'd decided whether to let it, and drove off to her shift 10 minutes late, with a smile I watched linger in the rearview mirror longer than either of us probably meant for it to. That evening she showed up at my kitchen door with a casserole dish balanced on one hip, said it was either a thank you or an apology for the 20s. She hadn't decided which, and stayed for 2 hours while it got cold on the counter because neither of us noticed the time passing. It became a rhythm after that, small trades neither of us kept score of. I taught her, one gray Sunday, how to lay a garden bed along the south wall of the cottage, turning the cold clay soil with a spade while she knelt beside me pulling old roots, asking questions about frost dates and soil pH like she intended to still be tending it in April. She taught me, in turn, how to make her mother's bread, standing at my own counter guiding my hands through a kneading motion I never quite got right, laughing every time the dough stuck stubbornly to my knuckles. You work land for a living, she said, flour on her cheek, and you can't manage flour and water. Cows don't require this much finesse, I said, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down, and something in my chest turned over quietly, and didn't turn back. The nights kept getting colder, and the porch sessions kept getting longer, and somewhere in there I stopped thinking of her as my tenant, and started thinking of her as the reason I looked forward to the end of every day. Then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Grady Poole found out she was still trying to buy her mother's house, and everything about our quiet arrangement got a great deal louder. I found out because Rosalind came up the drive one afternoon, 2 hours before her shift was supposed to start, which never happened, and her face when she got out of the car told me before she said a word that something had gone wrong. She was shaking. Not from cold. He raised it, she said, standing in my kitchen doorway like she wasn't sure she had the right to come further in. Grady, he heard I'd been asking around about buying the house. I guess word travels in this county too. And instead of selling to me, he's raising my mother's old rent to $1,400 a month on the tenants there now, just to squeeze more out of it before he flips it. And he told the realtor handling it that he'd rather burn the offer than sell to, and I'm quoting him, some cleaning girl who thinks sentiment pays a mortgage. I felt something go cold and still in my chest, the particular quiet that comes right before I do something I've already decided on. He said that to your face? He said it to a realtor who told a friend of mine who told me, which is somehow worse. He didn't even think I was worth saying it to directly. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes the way she had that first night in the car. 4 years, Caleb. 4 years of double shifts and skipping things I needed so I could save toward that house. And he's going to let it sit there being some stranger's overpriced rental, just because he can, just because it costs him nothing to be cruel about it. I crossed the kitchen and put my hands on her shoulders, steadying more than comforting at first, and felt her lean into it like she'd been waiting for permission to stop holding herself up alone. Then we find another way, I said. There isn't another way. I've looked at every way there is. There's always another way. There's just not always an easy one. I didn't have a plan yet when I said it. I only had the certainty that I wasn't going to watch her carry this by herself for one more month, one more year, one more double shift that left her crying in a parked car after midnight. What I had, it turned out, was land, 40 acres of it, most unused. The back parcel bordering the county road worth more to a man like Grady Poole than he'd ever admit to my face. Because he'd been sniffing around it for 2 years trying to get me to sell, so he could put up the kind of cheap rental units that were slowly turning half the farms outside Millbrook Falls into somebody's investment portfolio. I'd turned him down twice already on principle. I called him a third time with a different kind of leverage in mind. Grady Poole met me at the diner on Route 9 2 days later, the same diner where Rosalind poured coffee 3 mornings a week, which I suspected wasn't an accident on my part so much as a message I wanted him to receive without saying it out loud. He was a big, soft man in an expensive coat that didn't fit the county he'd made his money in, and he shook my hand with the particular firmness of someone who practiced it in a mirror. "Caleb Whitfield," he said, sliding into the booth. "Didn't figure you for a man who changed his mind about the back 40. "I haven't," I said. "I'm here about Miller Street." Something shifted behind his eyes, not surprise exactly. More the recalculation of a man realizing the conversation wasn't the one he'd walked in expecting. "That's not really your business, is it?" "I'm making it my business. I hear you turned down a fair offer from the woman who grew up in that house because you didn't like the shape of her paycheck." He spread his hands, unbothered. "It's a business decision. I've got other interest in that property at a number that beats hers by a wide margin." "I'll beat it," I said. "Cash. Closing in 30 days. And you get first right to buy 40 acres of my back parcel at the number you already offered me twice. Which I'm guessing you still want a great deal more than you want to make a point out of a woman who cleans your rental units." Grady went quiet a moment, doing the math a man like him always does, weighing spite against profit, and profit, as it usually does with men like Grady Poole. "1. You're going to hand that house right back to her," he said, half question, half accusation, like the sentiment offended him even as he was about to profit from it. "That's the plan." He almost laughed. "Romantic? All right, Whitfield, you want to overpay for a rundown house on a hunch about a girl who cleans offices? That's your money to waste." "It's not a hunch," I said. "And watch how you talk about her. You're about to make money off this conversation. You don't get to be cruel on top of it." Something flickered behind his eyes, the particular annoyance of a man unused to being corrected by someone he considered beneath him. 40 acres of usable frontage for a rundown 4-bedroom on Miller Street. You understand you're the one taking the bad end of this deal." "I understand exactly what I'm taking," I said. "You understand what you're giving up trying to hold on to." He studied me a long moment, calculating, the way men like Grady always calculate, weighing what a thing was worth against what it would cost him to keep being difficult about it. Finally, he shrugged, the particular shrug of a man convincing himself that profit had been his plan all along. "Bank draft, 30 days, and I want the back parcel survey updated before closing. I'm not buying a lawsuit along with your acreage." "Fine, and Whitfield." He leaned back in the booth, something almost like respect creeping into his voice despite himself. "For what it's worth, I've bought and sold 40 houses in this county and nobody's ever paid full price out of spite for the tenant on the wrong end of the deal. Hope she's worth it." "She's worth considerably more than this table's ever seen," I said, and left him to finish his coffee alone. He named his number. It was steep. It was also, with the back parcel on the table, exactly within reach, and I signed the paper 2 days later without telling Rosalind a single word about where I'd spent my Tuesday afternoon. I want to be honest about the next part, because it isn't the grand gesture people expect from a story like this. There was no ceremony to it. I drove to Miller Street on a gray Thursday morning with a locksmith named Pete Alvarez, who'd fixed half the doors in this county and asked no questions about the ones he was told to change. The house was smaller than I'd pictured from the way Rosalind talked about it, white clapboard gone gray at the edges, a porch that needed the same kind of patient work I'd been giving my own barn roof for years. The tenants Grady had installed were already gone. He'd evicted them the week prior once the paperwork cleared, which was its own small cruelty in a different direction I chose not to examine too closely that day. Pete rekeyed the front door in the back, handed me a small brass ring with 2 new keys on it, and left me standing alone on the porch of a house that belonged, as of 11 that morning, to nobody but the woman who didn't yet know it. I didn't tell her that day, or the next. I waited until Thanksgiving, Because some things deserve to land on a day already built for gratitude. She thought we were driving out to look at a friend's place I'd invented for the occasion. Some story about needing a second opinion on a fence line. And she went along with it the way she'd started going along with most of my odd requests that fall, trusting without asking too many questions, which I understood now was its own kind of gift she'd been giving me all along. When I turned onto Miller Street instead of the county road she expected, she went very still in the passenger seat. "Caleb," she said slowly, "why are we on my mother's street?" "Thought you might want to see the place," I said, keeping my voice level even though my hands weren't quite steady on the wheel. "Heard it might be for sale." "It's not for sale," Grady told the realtor he wasn't selling to. She stopped herself mid-sentence as I pulled into the driveway and put the truck in park, and I watched her face go through disbelief, then confusion, then something breaking open as she looked at the porch, the door, the small brass mailbox with her mother's old last name still faintly visible, under a layer of grime nobody had bothered to clean off. "He's not selling it to anybody else," I said quietly. "He already sold it. 2 weeks ago." She turned to me, eyes wide, hands pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from climbing out of it. "To who?" I reached into my coat pocket and set the small brass ring of keys in her palm, closing her fingers around it gently before I let go. "It's yours, Rosalind. Deed's already filed under your name. I changed the locks last Thursday so it'd be ready for you today." I paused, watching the tears start before I even finished. "I couldn't stand back and watch you work yourself into the ground for a house that ought to have been yours a long time ago. So I made it ours to fix, and yours to keep." For a long moment she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood in that gray November driveway staring at the keys in her open hand, like they might dissolve if she blinked. Then she looked up at me, and her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than breath. "You sold your land for this. I sold 40 acres I wasn't using for the only thing on either of our properties that's ever actually mattered," I said. "Wasn't a hard trade, Rosalind. Wasn't a trade at all, really. Felt more like putting something back where it belonged." She crossed the small distance between us and put both hands against my chest, not pushing, just resting them there like she needed to feel that I was real, that this whole gray Thursday was real. "I worked 3 jobs for 4 years and I still couldn't afford this house," she whispered. "And you just..." "So I changed the locks," I said softly, finishing it for her, the words landing exactly the way I'd been carrying them in my chest since the day I signed Grady Poole's paperwork, "and made it ours." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She stepped into me and I wrapped my arms around her, right there in the driveway of the house she'd grown up in. The house she'd spent 4 years of double shifts trying to earn back one exhausted dollar at a time, and for the first time since I'd met her, I felt her shoulders go still instead of shaking. Not from exhaustion this time, but from finally being allowed to put something down. We stood on that porch a long while before either of us said another word. When we finally went inside, dust sheets still covering the furniture Grady's tenants had left behind, Rosalind walked slowly from room to room, with her hand trailing along walls like she was reintroducing herself to a person she'd loved and lost. In the kitchen, she stopped at the counter by the window and pressed both palms flat against it, closing her eyes. "This is where she taught me to bake bread," she said. "I told you that once." "You did," I said, standing in the doorway, giving her the room she needed. "I used to stand right here on a stool so I could reach." She opened her eyes and looked at me, and something in her face had settled into a kind of peace I hadn't seen on her in the 8 months I'd known her. "I never thought I'd stand in this kitchen again as anything but a visitor asking a stranger's permission." "You're not asking anybody's permission anymore," I said. "Not for this house. Not for anything, if I've got any say in it." She crossed the kitchen and kissed me then. Slow and certain, tasting faintly of the coffee she'd had that morning, and something warmer underneath it that I understood. Even in that moment, I was going to spend the rest of my life chasing the feeling of. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against mine the way she used to rest it against her steering wheel on the nights she thought no one could hear her. "I love you," she said. Like it surprised her even as she said it, Like the words had been sitting in her chest a long time, waiting for a room safe enough to say them in. I don't know when it started. Maybe the eggs, maybe the firewood you cut smaller than you needed to. Maybe it was always going to start the first night you stood at that fence and didn't walk away. I love you too, I said. Been loving you a while longer than I let myself admit, I think. Didn't want to say it to a woman still fighting so hard just to keep her head above water. Didn't feel fair to ask for more of her heart when she barely had enough left over for herself. You didn't ask, she said, smiling through tears. You just kept showing up. That's different. That's better. We spent that Thanksgiving in her mother's kitchen. The two of us and a chicken I'd raised myself, and a pie Rosalind made from a recipe she said she hadn't dared try in years. Because it only ever tasted right in this exact kitchen, with this exact light coming through this exact window. She was right. It did. The months after that moved the way real life moves, once the hardest part is over. Not without work, but without the particular desperation that had shaped every one of Rosalind's days for 4 years straight. She gave notice at the cleaning job in Rutland first, then eventually at the nursing home, though she kept that one longest, because she said the residents there had become something like family, and she wasn't ready to let them go, just because she no longer had to. She kept her shifts at the diner too, fewer of them, because she said she liked the work honestly, not just the paycheck. And there's a difference between a job you're trapped in and one you choose to keep. I split my time between the farm and Miller Street for a while, fixing what needed fixing on both properties, learning the particular quiet of her mother's kitchen the same way I'd once learned the quiet of my own. Grady Poole, for his part, never spoke to either of us again beyond a curt nod if our paths crossed in town, though I heard through the same gossip channel that had first carried his cruelty back to Rosalind that he'd grumbled for months about the handyman farmer who'd out-negotiated him over a house he'd never actually wanted in the first place, only wanted to deny. By spring, Rosalind had moved the last of her things out of the cottage down past my second barn, though she still calls it hers sometimes, half joking, because she says the eggs were better than any place she's ever lived. We didn't rush anything after that. We didn't need to. Some evenings I stayed at Miller Street, falling asleep to a kitchen that smelled faintly, always of bread. Some evenings she drove out to the farm and sat with me on the porch of the cottage where all of it started, wrapped in that same blanket, watching my 6 cows amble toward the barn on their own unhurried schedule. It was on that porch, the following October, almost exactly a year after the night I'd first heard her crying in a car she thought no one could hear, that I asked her to marry me. I didn't have a speech prepared. I'd never been much for speeches. I just took her hand the way I had that day in the driveway on Miller Street, and told her that I'd spent 32 years thinking a farm was the only thing worth holding on to out of loyalty to the people who'd built it. And then she'd shown up in a rundown guest cottage working herself half to death for a house full of memory, and taught me that the things worth keeping were never really the buildings at all. They were the people who made a place feel like it belonged to somebody. She said yes before I'd even finished getting the ring out of my coat pocket, laughing through tears the way she had that gray Thursday in November, and when I finally slid it onto her finger she looked down at it. Then up at the farmhouse behind us. Then out toward the dark shape of Miller Street somewhere beyond the ridge where her mother's kitchen was waiting with its particular smell of bread, and its particular light through its particular window. 2 houses, she said softly, and somehow it only ever felt like one life. That's the only kind worth having, I said, and pulled her in close against the cold. The two of us watching the last of the light go down over land that had finally, after all those years of quiet and all those months of watching her carry more than any one person should carry alone, come to feel like exactly what it was. Home, not a building, not an address on Miller Street or a fence line half a mile past my own porch, just her and me, and the particular unhurried peace of 2 people who had finally stopped working themselves, ragged trying to earn a place to rest, and simply built one instead, together, out of whatever they had left to give each other.